David never imagined that moving to the lake would bring more drama than peace. He had chosen this quiet stretch of water for one reason: escape. After years of city noise, HOA rules, and constant meetings about mailbox paint colors and lawn lengths, this lake house was supposed to be his sanctuary. No loud neighbors, no strict regulations, just the sound of the water lapping against the shore and the occasional call of a loon, or so he thought. The evening sun painted the water gold as David sat on his porch with a book in hand. The soft rustle of the breeze through the trees gave him a sense of calm he hadn't felt in years. But that calm was shattered by the sharp, deliberate sound of heels clicking against the wooden pathway. David looked up and saw her for the first time. Karen. Clipboard in one hand, pen in the other, she marched toward him like a soldier reporting for duty. "Good evening," she said in a tone that was more commanding than polite. "I'm Karen, president of the Lakeview Homeowners Association. I'm here to welcome you and to explain how things work around here." David closed his book and offered a polite smile. "Appreciate the visit, but I'm not interested in joining any HOA. My deed is free and clear. No obligations." Karen blinked as though she hadn't heard correctly. "Excuse me? Everyone here joins the HOA. It's how we keep the community organized. There are dues, meetings, and of course, rules you'll need to follow. It's non-negotiable." David's calm demeanor didn't change. "I understand, but as I said, my property isn't part of the HOA. I've already confirmed with the county records." For a moment, silence hung between them. The only sound was the water gently brushing against the dock. Karen's face hardened, her lips pressed into a thin line, and her grip on the clipboard tightened. "No one," she said slowly, "gets away with saying no to the HOA." David raised an eyebrow but remained silent. He had dealt with difficult people before, but something about Karen's determined glare told him this wasn't going to be a one-time conversation. She turned sharply on her heels, muttering under her breath as she walked away, the evening air now heavy with tension. David leaned back in his chair, exhaling. He didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning of a battle that would shake the entire neighborhood and leave Karen facing a truth she never expected. The next morning, David stepped outside with a cup of coffee in hand, hoping to enjoy the stillness of the lake. The water shimmered in the soft light of dawn, and for a moment he thought perhaps last night's confrontation with Karen had been nothing more than an overzealous welcome. But as he reached for the newspaper on his porch, his eyes caught a flash of bright paper taped to his door. It was a notice written in bold letters: "Lakeview HOA membership dues, $300. Payment required immediately." David frowned. Below the headline, Karen had scrawled in red ink, "Failure to comply will result in consequences." He chuckled softly, shaking his head as he pulled it down. "Consequences," he muttered. "She really thinks she runs this place." Later that afternoon, as he returned from the grocery store, Karen was waiting in his driveway. Arms crossed, clipboard in hand, her posture screamed authority. "David," she began, her voice sharp, "I trust you saw the notice. Your payment is overdue. We can't make exceptions. Everyone pays their share." David set his grocery bags down, meeting her gaze calmly. "Karen, I think we need to be clear. My property isn't tied to your HOA. I bought it specifically because it was independent. I'm not required to pay anything." Her eyes narrowed. "That's not how it works. This community thrives because we follow the rules. If one person refuses, it sets a bad example. What makes you think you're above everyone else?" David's voice stayed level, but his words carried weight. "I don't think I'm above anyone. I just don't like paying for rules that don't apply to me." For a long moment, Karen didn't respond. The only sound was the wind stirring the branches overhead. Then she snapped her clipboard shut and pointed to him. "You'll regret this," she said flatly. "I'll make sure of it." Neighbors across the street peeked through curtains, their silhouettes barely visible. Some of them had lived under Karen's HOA for years, too afraid or too tired to challenge her authority. But now they were watching closely, curious about the new man who dared to say no. David picked up his groceries, unfazed by the threat. He had faced worse battles than a clipboard-wielding neighbor. But deep down, he sensed Karen wasn't finished. And judging by the fire in her eyes, she was about to escalate this small standoff into something much larger. The days that followed were anything but quiet. David had hoped that Karen's threats would fade, but instead her persistence only grew stronger. What began as a notice on his door quickly evolved into a campaign. On Tuesday morning, he found a flyer tucked beneath his windshield wiper. HOA violator, refuses to pay dues, hurts our community. The words were bold, surrounded by an aggressive red border. Beneath it, Karen had added a handwritten note. Neighbors, we must stand together. David sighed as he crumpled the paper in his hand. He had lived in the neighborhood for barely 2 weeks, yet Karen was determined to paint him as the enemy. That afternoon, while unloading groceries, he noticed 2 neighbors across the street watching him. They didn't wave. They didn't smile. Instead, they whispered, their eyes darting between him and Karen, who stood proudly on her porch with folded arms, as though orchestrating the entire scene. By Thursday, the situation escalated further. Karen stormed up to his porch, clipboard in hand, her voice rising with every word. "You are breaking the rules of this community, David," she shouted, loud enough for half the street to hear. "You're using the lake, the roads, the lighting, yet you refuse to pay your fair share. That is theft, plain and simple." David stepped outside, calm but firm. "Karen, let me explain this again. My property deed shows no requirement to join your HOA. I pay my taxes, I maintain my land, and I have every legal right to use the lakefront. Nothing in your bylaws gives you authority over me." Karen's eyes burned with fury. "That's what you think, but I won't let you ruin the harmony of this neighborhood. If you won't follow the rules voluntarily, then I'll call the authorities. We'll see how long you keep that smug smile when the police arrive." Neighbors had gathered now, standing on sidewalks, leaning against mailboxes, watching the drama unfold. Some shook their heads, others looked uneasy. David noticed the ripple of tension spreading through the crowd. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't let anger win. He simply looked Karen in the eye and said, "If you think I'm doing something illegal, call him. I have nothing to hide." Karen's jaw clenched. She turned away abruptly, dialing her phone with quick, stabbing motions. "Fine," she said over her shoulder. "We'll let the cops decide." David leaned against his porch railing, unshaken. If this was the battle she wanted, he was ready. The evening sun had just dipped below the trees when flashing blue and red lights reflected off the calm waters of the lake. David was sitting on his porch with a glass of iced tea when the squad car pulled up in front of his driveway. As predicted, Karen was waiting at the curb, arms folded tightly across her chest, her expression triumphant, as though the cavalry had finally arrived to enforce her will. 2 officers stepped out of the vehicle, their demeanor calm but alert. Karen hurried toward them, her voice rising in an urgent pitch. "Officers, thank goodness you're here," she exclaimed. "This man refuses to join the HOA and is trespassing on our lake property. He's been using community resources without paying his dues. It's illegal. He's stealing from all of us." The officers exchanged a glance before one of them turned to David, who remained seated, relaxed but attentive. "Sir, would you mind explaining your side of this?" David stood and walked down the steps slowly, holding no paperwork in his hands yet, only his calm composure. "Officers, my name is David Miller. I purchased this property 2 weeks ago. The deed clearly states my land is exempt from the HOA. I pay for my own utilities. I maintain my own dock, and I am not legally bound to join Karen's association. She's been harassing me ever since I declined." Karen stomped a foot. "He's lying. Everyone in this neighborhood is part of the HOA. We can't let one man think he's above the rules. Look at him. Smug, arrogant. He's breaking the system." The taller officer raised a hand gently, signaling her to calm down. "Ma'am, do you have documentation that proves his property falls under your HOA's jurisdiction?" Karen faltered, clutching her clipboard closer. "Well, I don't have it on me right now, but everyone knows the rules. It's common sense." David resisted the urge to smile. "I do have documentation," he said evenly. "It's inside. Would you like me to get it?" The officers nodded. David disappeared briefly into his house and returned with a neatly folded folder. Inside were his deed, tax records, and an official note from the county confirming that his property was not, and never had been, under any HOA covenant. The officers took their time reviewing the papers. Karen hovered nearby, her confidence visibly shrinking with every second of silence. When the officer finally looked up, his expression was clear. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "this man is not required to join your HOA. His ownership documents are valid. There's nothing unlawful here." Karen's jaw dropped. For once, she was speechless. The evening air hung thick with tension, the kind that made every sound sharper, every movement slower. The officers had just handed David back his folder of documents, nodding in quiet confirmation. "Everything looks clear, Mr. Miller," one of them said. "Your property is independent. You're not obligated to join the HOA." The words landed like a hammer. The neighbors who had gathered along the sidewalks exchanged hushed whispers. Karen, however, wasn't ready to surrender. Her face was flushed crimson, her knuckles white as she clutched her clipboard like it was a lifeline. "This isn't right," she snapped, her voice rising. "He has to be part of the HOA. If he's allowed to live here without paying dues, then what's the point of our rules? What's the point of me enforcing them? This ruins everything." David stood quietly, watching her unravel. For a brief moment, he felt a twinge of sympathy. Karen wasn't just defending rules, she was defending an identity she had built for herself. The clipboard wasn't just wooden paper. To her, it was power, respect, control. Without it, she was just another neighbor. But David also knew this charade couldn't continue. She had crossed too many lines, spreading flyers with his name, rallying neighbors against him, and now dragging the police into a matter she didn't understand. He had stayed patient, but Karen's obsession left him with no choice but to tell the truth. "Karen," he began, his voice calm but steady, "you've made this more complicated than it needed to be." I tried to explain. "I showed you the records. But since you insist on pushing this further, I think it's time I tell you something important." Karen glared at him, suspicious but also desperate. "And what could you possibly say that changes the fact you're breaking the rules?" David took a breath, scanning the crowd. The neighbors leaned in unconsciously, curious. Even the officers seemed interested. Then with quiet precision, David said the words that would shatter Karen's confidence completely. "Not only am I not under your HOA," he said, pausing to let the weight of it sink in, "but I also own several properties in Lakeview. In fact, Karen, one of those houses is yours." For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. The murmurs of neighbors turned into audible gasps. One man actually dropped his coffee cup, the ceramic shattering softly against the pavement. Karen blinked rapidly, her face draining of color. "What?" she whispered, almost inaudibly. "You rent your home, don't you?" David continued gently. "The lease goes through a management company. That company sends your payments along to the property owner. That property owner is me." Karen's clipboard slipped slightly in her grasp. Her eyes widened, darting to the officers, then to the neighbors, then back to David, as though waiting for someone to call this a cruel joke. But no one did. David didn't gloat. His voice was calm, his posture relaxed, but his words carried undeniable weight. "So while you've been accusing me of breaking rules, threatening me, and calling the police, you've been doing it to your landlord." The silence was crushing. The officers exchanged glances, their lips twitching as though they were suppressing incredulous smiles. Neighbors stared, some with widened eyes, others with small smirks tugging at the corners of their mouths. Karen's breathing quickened. This can't be true," she stammered. "You're lying. You're trying to humiliate me." David pulled one last paper from his folder and handed it to the nearest officer. "This is the ownership record. It's public information. If anyone doubts me, they can confirm it at the county office. It's all right there." The officer scanned the paper, then looked up. "It's real," he said simply. Karen swayed slightly, as though the ground beneath her had shifted. Her clipboard finally slipped from her grasp and clattered against the driveway. For the first time in years, the woman who had always walked with rigid authority now looked small, fragile, exposed. David, still composed, spoke softly enough for her to hear, but loud enough for the neighbors to catch every word. Respect, Karen. It goes further than intimidation. I don't want conflict, and I don't want enemies, but I also won't be bullied in a place I call home. Karen's lips trembled, but no words came out. The crowd was no longer on her side, and she knew it. For the first time in Lakeview history, Karen had nothing left to say. The world seemed to pause after David's revelation. The neighbors who had always kept their distance during Karen's rule patrols now stood openly in their yards, whispering in disbelief. The woman who had barked orders about trash bins, lawn heights, and holiday decorations had just been exposed, and not by a neighbor's complaint, but by a truth that undercut her authority completely. Karen bent down slowly, fumbling to pick up her clipboard, but her trembling fingers betrayed her. It slipped from her grasp again, landing with a dull thud on the pavement. She looked as though the earth itself had betrayed her, shifting beneath her shoes. "This isn't real," she muttered, shaking her head. Her voice cracked under the weight of humiliation. You're making this up to embarrass me. Everyone here knows I run the HOA. I make the rules. You can't just..." David didn't raise his voice. He didn't even step forward. His calm presence alone was enough to silence the frantic edge in her words. "I didn't make anything up, Karen. The records are public. The officers saw them. You've been threatening your landlord. That's the truth." A ripple of laughter, soft, hesitant at first, moved through the neighbors. One man smirked, whispering to his wife, "She's been policing all of us, but she didn't even know who owned her house." His wife stifled a chuckle, though her eyes still lingered on Karen with pity. The officers, professional as ever, kept their composure, but even they couldn't mask the faint amusement in their eyes. One of them finally cleared his throat and said, "Ma'am, there's nothing more for us to do here. He hasn't broken any laws. We suggest you let this go." "Let this go?" Karen repeated, her voice hollow. Those words had never been spoken to her before. She was always the one telling others what they had to let go of. Rules, fines, complaints. Her clipboard had always carried weight, but now, in front of everyone, she felt stripped of that authority. The neighbors' body language shifted too. Where once they had looked at Karen with caution, now they looked at David with quiet admiration. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't retaliated with insults. He had stood calmly, presenting truth like a shield, and in doing so he had shown them what real strength looked like. Karen's shoulders sagged. She turned slowly, her face pale except for the angry flush burning across her cheeks. She searched the crowd for a friendly face, but found none. Even those who had once been her silent supporters looked away, ashamed to meet her gaze. She finally turned back to David, her voice breaking. "You could have told me sooner," she whispered, her eyes glassy. "You could have spared me this humiliation." David met her gaze with the same calm kindness he had shown from the beginning. "I tried, Karen. I told you I wasn't under the HOA. I told you I had no obligation. But instead of listening, you pushed harder. Sometimes the problem isn't the answer. It's the refusal to hear it." Karen flinched as though the words themselves had cut her. She opened her mouth to argue, but the weight of the truth pressed too heavily against her pride. Instead, she clutched her clipboard to her chest like a shield, turned on her heel, and walked briskly toward her house. The neighbors stood in silence for a long moment. Then one by one they began drifting back to their homes. But the whispers continued, carried on the evening air. She finally got put in her place. About time someone stood up to her. "Imagine bossing around your own landlord." Karen heard every word, though she didn't dare look back. Each whisper felt like a stone in her chest, pulling her deeper into the humiliation she had never thought possible. And David? He remained on his porch, quiet, steady, watching the lake reflect the last rays of sunlight. He hadn't won by shouting, nor by fighting. He had won by standing firm in truth, For Karen, the realization was crushing. The authority she had built for years wasn't power at all. It was fear, and tonight that fear was gone. The neighborhood felt different in the days that followed. For years, Karen's clipboard had been a symbol of control. Neighbors trimming hedges, repainting shutters, or moving garbage bins out of fear of her knock. But after that evening, the clipboard seemed powerless. Karen kept to herself. Where she once patrolled the sidewalks daily, now her curtains stayed drawn. She no longer barked orders about mailbox heights or lawn decorations. Instead, she avoided eye contact, slipping quietly into her car or ducking into her house whenever neighbors were nearby. The silence around her home spoke louder than her past commands. David, however, became a quiet symbol of something different. Neighbors who had once hesitated to wave now greeted him warmly. One man stopped him by the mailbox. "You stood up to her without ever raising your voice. We should have done that years ago." Others nodded in agreement, finally realizing that Karen's power had always been rooted in fear, and that truth had the power to dissolve it. Despite everything, David bore no grudge. He had moved to the lake for peace, not for conflict, and he refused to let bitterness settle in. When a few neighbors suggested pressing charges for harassment, he shook his head. "The lesson has already been learned," he said simply. "That's enough." And in a way, it was. The community began to breathe easier. Children played by the lake without Karen's interruptions. Families decorated their porches with flowers, flags, and lights without receiving warning slips. For the first time in years, Lakeview felt like a neighborhood, not a dictatorship. As for Karen, her pride had taken a heavy fall, but deep down, even she couldn't ignore the truth. Authority built on fear is fragile. Authority built on respect lasts longer. One quiet evening, David sat once again on his porch, the water reflecting the fading light. The crickets chirped, and the air was calm, just as he had hoped when he first moved here. He smiled to himself. He hadn't come to Lakeview to become a leader, yet somehow, by standing his ground, he had helped free the neighborhood from years of unnecessary control. Peace had returned to the lake.